Imagine waking up one morning and not knowing what country you live in. Not because you moved, not because of a war you fought in, but because the world outside your village made for completely different decisions about who owned the ground beneath your feet before the sun went down. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what happened on August 17, 1945, and the island where it happened has been quietly left out of the history books that the rest of the world reads. What unfolded that day was not just a political accident. It was the collision of empires, the death rattle of colonialism, and the birth of a nation, all compressed into a single 24-hour window, and the people caught inside it were never asked a single question about any of it. To understand what August 17th meant, you have to understand what the weeks before it looked like, because the world in early August 1945 was not ending slowly. It was ending all at once. On August 6th, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, they dropped a second one on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito made a radio broadcast so shocking, so alien to the ears of an entire generation of Japanese people who had been told their emperor was divine and their empire was invincible, that many of the soldiers who heard it simply refused to believe it was real. Japan was surrendering. The largest empire in Asia, the force that had swept through China, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and the Dutch East Indies with terrifying speed, was folding. And in that folding, a vacuum opened up. A vacuum that every surviving colonial power on Earth immediately began racing to fill. The Dutch East Indies had been under Dutch colonial control since the early 1600s. 300 years. 300 years of spice extraction, of forced labor systems, of an economic architecture specifically designed to funnel the staggering natural wealth of the Indonesian archipelago into European bank accounts. Then in 1942, the Japanese military invaded and dismantled Dutch colonial authority in a matter of weeks. The Dutch, already occupied by Nazi Germany back in Europe, could do almost nothing, and so the islands passed to Japan. But Japanese occupation was not liberation. It was a different kind of control, often brutally enforced, with Indonesian laborers conscripted as Romusha, forced workers, dying by the hundreds of thousands on Japanese construction projects across Asia. The Indonesian people had gone from one occupier to another without ever being consulted, without ever being given a vote, without anyone in either colonial capital ever asking what they themselves wanted. What Japan's occupation did accidentally produce, however, was a political awakening. With the Dutch gone, Indonesian nationalist leaders who had spent decades being imprisoned, exiled, and surveilled by colonial authorities suddenly had room to organize. The two most important figures in this story are Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta. Sukarno was charismatic, visionary, a speaker who could hold tens of thousands of people, spellbound with his voice alone. Hatta was precise, methodical, the intellectual counterweight to Sukarno's fire. Together they had dreamed for decades of an independent Indonesia. And by August 1945, with Japan collapsing and the Dutch not yet returned, that dream was closer than it had ever been, and more dangerous than it had ever been, because the window to act was almost certainly going to be very, very small. The Japanese surrender announcement on August 15th sent shockwaves through the nationalist movement. Younger, more radical members immediately began pressuring Sukarno to declare independence at once. That same day, before any other power could step in and claim authority, Sukarno hesitated. He was afraid of what a premature declaration might trigger. He was afraid of the Japanese troops still stationed throughout the islands, armed, confused, and awaiting orders that hadn't come yet. He was afraid of the British, who were expected to arrive as part of the Allied reoccupation force. He was afraid of the Dutch, who had already made it unambiguously clear they intended to take their colony back the moment the Japanese were gone. His hesitation cost him 2 days. On the night of August 15th, a group of young nationalists, furious at the delay, kidnapped Sukarno and Hatta and took them to a house outside Jakarta. The demand was simple. Declare independence now, or lose the moment forever. Sukarno declared independence on the morning of August 17, 1945. The proclamation was 2 sentences long. It was read in front of a small crowd outside his home in Jakarta. It was typed on a borrowed typewriter. It lasted less than 2 minutes, and in those 2 minutes, the Republic of Indonesia was born, at least in the minds and hearts of everyone standing in that courtyard. But here is where the story fractures into something almost impossible to hold in your mind all at once, because that declaration did not resolve anything. It created a new layer of chaos on top of an already disintegrating situation, and on the islands that sat between the world's former certainties and its new realities, The next several hours became something no political theorist had ever prepared a framework for. On certain islands in the archipelago, Japanese commanders were still technically in control as of the morning of August 17th, bound by their surrender agreement to maintain order until Allied forces arrived. This meant that in the same hours that Sukarno was reading his two-sentence proclamation in Jakarta, Japanese soldiers on other islands were still manning their posts, still flying the rising sun flag, still the de facto administrative authority over millions of people. Then word began filtering through Allied command channels that British forces, operating under the Southeast Asia Command, led by Admiral Louis Mountbatten, were moving to accept Japanese surrenders and restore order throughout the region. The British were not coming as liberators, they were coming as administrators, tasked with stabilizing the territory until the Dutch could formally return and reassert their colonial authority. The Dutch were already preparing ships. They had governments in exile. They had colonial administrators in waiting. They had 300 years of infrastructure and institutional memory, and they had absolutely no intention of acknowledging that a two-sentence proclamation read in someone's front yard changed any of that. So, on that single day, August 17, 1945, here is what existed simultaneously. Japanese military authority, still physically present, armed, and technically obligated by surrender terms to maintain control. British administrative authority, incoming, claiming jurisdiction as the Allied representative power. Dutch colonial authority, asserting that their pre-war sovereignty had never legally lapsed and that nothing that had happened in the interim changed their ownership of the territory. And the Republic of Indonesia declared that morning, claiming that the people of the archipelago had the right to determine their own future and that the era of colonial ownership was simply over. 4 claims. 4 flags, essentially, and the people on the ground beneath all of them, the farmers and fishermen and merchants and students on islands like Sulawesi, like Kalimantan, like islands so small they don't appear on most world maps. Those people woke up that morning, not knowing which authority, if any, they were supposed to answer to. What followed, August 17th, was not a clean handover. It was 4 years of brutal, grinding revolutionary warfare known in Indonesia as the Bersiap period and the Indonesian National Revolution. The Dutch launched 2 major military offensives they called police actions, as though the systematic attempt to reconquer a nation of 70 million people was equivalent to maintaining civil order. The British, trapped between their Allied obligations to restore Dutch authority and their private awareness that the era of European colonialism was probably finished, tried to play both sides and succeeded mostly in making everyone furious at them. The Japanese soldiers still on the islands existed in a legal and moral no man's land. Some obeyed their surrender orders and handed weapons to Dutch forces. Others, moved by something harder to define, something that looked almost like conscience, handed their weapons to Indonesian Republicans instead. The revolution ended officially in December 1949, when the Netherlands formally transferred sovereignty to the Republic of Indonesia. For years, for months, and 12 days after that two-sentence proclamation. But the 48 hours around August 17, 1945, remain one of the most extraordinary moments in modern political history, precisely because of what they reveal about the fiction at the heart of colonial power. The Dutch did not own those islands because of any natural law. They owned them because they had arrived with ships and guns and the organizational capacity to enforce their claim. Japan did not own them for the 3.5 years of occupation. They held them at gunpoint. Britain did not own them in the hours after the surrender. They simply arrived first with the paperwork. And the Republic of Indonesia, on the morning of August 17th, owned them in the only way that has ever actually mattered, in the belief and the will of the people who lived there, which is the same thing every nation on earth is ultimately built on, and which every empire in history has ultimately discovered. You cannot take away with ships, or soldiers, or administrative orders, no matter how many you send. The people who woke up on those islands on August 17, 1945, not knowing who they belonged to, were asking, without words, the most important political question in human history. The answer, it turned out, was the one that had always been true, and that colonialism had spent 3 centuries trying to bury. They belonged to themselves.